We are grateful for your gifts. I was just thinking how much I love the length of time that the final note rests with the sustain when you play, Lisa, in part because it resonates with my message today, so that's good. So keep that in mind, the resonance that hung on for a long time. We often, when we speak of pride, go back just a little over 50 years to the Stonewall uprisings, and many people may not have a lot of knowledge about that. I'm actually not going to go into that today. Instead, I'm going to go a little farther back. So we're going to hit the sustain pedal a little bit longer. On October 4th in 1957, the former Soviet Union, what is now the former Soviet Union, launched the satellite Sputnik and set off a panic among the ideological heads of state. They set off a panic within the federal government, and that panic ignited the frantic fuel of the Cold War space race. Of course, a panic was already there in the form of paranoid politics, exemplified by the Senator Joseph McCarthy's public persecutions, and he's not even the start. Because what gave rise to McCarthy were the policies and paranoia that had been in place for a few decades, and they were fed by a deep distrust of difference. The legislative push toward conformity and the punishment of difference took off within local municipalities as well. Alongside J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, local law enforcement in many cities had begun using entrapment and domestic spying tools to deal with perceived moral threats. The United States had succumbed once again to its Puritan forebears. In Washington, D.C., as gay male activity in public spaces increased, officials installed lighting around monuments and public parks and increased officer patrols using language that leaves no question as to what they were trying to prevent. These efforts were not in response to a concern about lawlessness or violent crime, but in the interest of morality. In 1946, the National Park Service in DC employed 6 plainclothes officers whose entire job was to monitor public restrooms for immoral behavior. All of this time and energy and money and spying, invasion of privacy to prevent people from engaging in consensual sexual acts in the only places available to them. Really, parks and bathrooms and back alleys. The government officials in charge of these efforts were explicitly responding to the perverse practices that they claimed their soldiers had picked up while in France or while at sea, blaming the soldiers that they had sent to go fight wars that they asked them to fight for bringing back widened ideas. No matter that the morality laws of the land deemed that all sexual encounters engaged in outside the bonds of marriage were illegal, with the exception of spousal rape. And yet consensual acts between heterosexual adults were rarely prosecuted. But homosexuals lived in perpetual fear of exposure. Names, addresses, occupations of those arrested for engaging in consensual sexual acts appeared in the next day's newspaper for families and employers to see. 6 arrested in perversion case. The impact. After World War II, homosexual arrests, including those for sodomy, dancing, kissing, holding hands, occurred at the rate of 1 every 10 minutes, each hour of each day for 15 years. 1 every 10 minutes, each hour of each day for 15 years. Any society that would send men to war and ask them to engage in dangerous and psychologically threatening offensives and then blame them for how and when they sought comfort is inherently socially unstable. To push men with same-sex attraction so far to the margins that there was no space available to conceive of building stable and loving relationships that at least some of these men craved or might have needed to work toward their psychological health and well-being post-war was available to them. Especially any who carried within themselves culturally constructed prisons of shame or self-abasement for their desires. 1 every 10 minutes, each hour of each day for 15 years. Into this landscape, a talented young astronomer named Frank Kameny sought to help his government in their quest to respond to Sputnik. His knowledge and his talent were undeniable. He was born to Ashkenazi Jewish parents in New York City, and he began college in 1941 at the age of 16, knowing that he wanted to be an astronomer. But he was also sexually attracted to men and had been caught in a restroom in Berkeley, California, in what was actually a rather benign encounter. He had less benign encounters, but what he was caught in was actually a very benign encounter. And the government, despite how much they needed his skills in their geopolitical efforts, chose instead to ruin him because they could. In 1957, Kameny was fired from his job with the Army Map Service by the US Civil Service Commission for being gay. In 1958, he was barred from future employment, all future employment, by the federal government. But because his training and his interest lay in astronomy, and because all funding for that work was funneled through the government, even with civilian agencies and academic institutions, that prohibition ultimately meant that he was fated never to work in a field that he loved, for which he was immensely gifted, to the goal he had held since he was a small child in the service of a country that he held allegiance toward. For 15 years, he unsuccessfully sought to clear his name, hoping that the entire time that he would again hold the security clearance that he would need to pursue his love of astronomy. He appealed his firing through the courts twice, losing 2 cases before attempting to bring his plight to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. He twice received a letter from the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a personal letter explaining why they would not take up his case. He never, in all of the time that he was fighting his case, talked about his sexual orientation, almost up until the end. He denied that it was an actual thing that had happened. He denied the encounter. He had this sense of, it makes sense that I should be allowed to do this thing within society because it's consensual and because we're not hurting anybody, but he didn't talk about it in any of those cases. I invite you to take a few moments and place yourself into the shoes of a person who had 3 main loves: astronomy, the country to which his parents had emigrated, and men as sexual partners. After the failure of his Supreme Court efforts, Kameny never again held a paid job, and he devoted his life to activism. What that meant, though, was that before Stonewall, in the 50s and early 60s, in that time, he began as an activist to work on building up public protests against the government prohibition of anybody who was homosexual working in the government. They helped to coordinate a picket line in the White House in 1965, and they eventually did ones at the Pentagon and the US Civil Service Commission and at Independence Hall in Philadelphia for what became known as the Annual Reminder for Gay Rights. Just in case you forgot, we're still here. He wrote letters to President Kennedy. He drafted a bill that would overturn DC sodomy laws that was passed 30 years later. To get to the place of comfortable, proud, righteous activism, he first had to get over his sense of shame, because he was not initially claiming anything about his identity as he was fighting it. He explained it away as scientific mind and curiosity initially. And not until he began to build his own arguments to take his case to the Supreme Court did he begin to apply that rational mind to the dominant culture that told him there was something deviant or wrong about him. And he said, "I take the stand that not only is homosexuality, whether by inclination or overt act, not immoral, but that homosexual acts engaged in by consenting adults are moral in a positive and real sense, and are right, good, and desirable, both for the society and the individual and the participants of which that society has." He coined the slogan, "Gay is good." And then he went on to insist that the DSM remove homosexuality as a mental disease, which they did in 1973. He described that day, December 15th, 1973, as the day we were cured en masse by the psychiatrists. I had never read his story before? How many of you have heard of Frank Kameny before? I'm just curious. He died in 2011, and he spent all of the rest of his life working towards gay rights and activism, but he did not work another day in his life. He was held aloft by friends and community in his work. Most of my knowledge began in Stonewall with this sort of sense that everything that happened before them was this black box of wartime stuff, and I don't even know. Stonewall carried through the 80s in AIDS activism, a lot of knowledge about that, and into marriage equality through the Supreme Court. We spend a lot of time talking about that, but we forget that there's this whole sustain going back into history. And I bring this up in part because my own history, my own life has brought me into close contact with the importance of maintaining security clearances to work with highly classified material. I grew up in a town where that was the necessity. There were a lot of secrets in that town, but you couldn't keep secrets from the people who might blackmail you. Anything that a person sought to keep hidden was a target for blackmail by foreign states. And yet, for 15 years, 1, 5, 10, 15, all of these people were being taken out by the government. In 1989, my parents divorced, and several months later, my mother, who held a high security clearance in order to do computer science job that literally had her locked in a vault during her working days, began a relationship with a woman that continues to this day. And she had to tell her bosses and human resources about this relationship before she could tell her children. One of the things that we know about spiritual development and growth as people is that humility is admirable. We aim towards it. We want to achieve some sense of humility. And we put on the opposite side of that this sense of pride. What is pride in relationship to humility? The Jewish idea of musar, soul traits, uses humility and puts it on this spectrum and says, we have this sort of range of self-abasement on the one hand, and then humility, and then pride, and then arrogance. That's sort of the spectrum that's there. So humility is not this extreme quality. Self-abasement is this extreme quality. Arrogance is the extreme quality. Pride has some value in it. And we can think about this, and if we think about what we have to grow towards, that's the idea behind these soul traits. How do we grow towards humility? How do we grow towards what we most need? I think we've gotten to a place in our society where we recognize that generational trauma has been passed down from people to people who have been oppressed throughout history. What that means to me is that if you are a person who has inherited generational trauma, it is your duty to the community to lean into pride, to lean into who you are with proud awareness of what it means to be your full identity. That also means that if you are somebody for whom that's not the case, that has received a lot of privilege by virtue of the society that we live in, your goal, your role is to lean towards humility and listening and hearing the stories that you failed to hear before. What we want to avoid in general is arrogance and self-abasement on either side, because those are both ego-driven ideas. We don't listen on either side. They're both versions of the same kind of self-worship, arrogance and self-abasement. So we want to move into this space where we occupy humility and pride as two sides of a healthy coin. As humans, we are sexual beings. We are drawn toward love and intimacy and connection with other human beings, and our existence as healthy human adults is contingent on allowing ourselves to freely own and pursue those aspects of our humanity in whatever way they emerge in us. Whatever labels fit our understandings of ourselves, whether asexual or demisexual or gender non-binary or queer or lesbian or bisexual, transgender, gay, our faith calls us to support one another in our quest for spiritual development. And that includes supporting one another in our vast array of expressions of self-understanding, rather than writing our own experience or a dominant and puritanical perspective on top of those we encounter. Our sexual and gender identities are aspects of our spiritual understandings. They are a tool that we use in pursuit of our own flourishing and our spiritual growth. To pretend that we are not sexual beings, to pretend that we are not drawn to people and community, is to make a mockery of the spiritual quest as a whole. We must work to possess enough self-confidence that we can move through a world that prizes conformity of body type or family type, of gender expression or sexual orientation. Move through that world and give as much confidence to those who need it as much as we can. That's what it means to do this work together. The writer Eli Clare explains the importance of pride within historically oppressed communities. He writes that pride works in direct opposition to internalized oppression. The latter provides fertile ground for shame, denial, self-hatred, and fear. The former, pride, encourages anger, strength, and joy. To transform self-hatred into pride is a fundamental act of resistance. I wish I could stand up here and talk about the extraordinary shifts in our society that made it possible for my mother in 1989 to work for the federal government while also being in a relationship with a woman. I wish I could talk about the repeal of laws criminalizing the sexual impulses of consenting adults. I wish I could claim that we have entered into an age of enlightenment as it relates to love and personal identity, that we have seen the positive impact of difference on our society as a whole, that we are witnessing the social impacts of millions of people who are able to use pride as a key to unlock those prisons of shame. I wish. And yet, trans and non-binary people are under attack throughout this country. Those who claim trans or non-binary identity experience extreme pressure to hide their true selves, and this is especially true of our young people. As I shared a few weeks ago, I know of several families who are migrating in an effort to shield their children from narrow and power-motivated codification of prejudice into law. One family is leaving behind academic tenure and leaving this country to move to the Netherlands. It's the reverse migration of Frank Kaminy's family, Jews emigrating to the US in search of safety and support in communities of expressed tolerance. We have come full circle. What's the good news here? Well, we no longer have a government that actively seeks to destroy our lives through entrapment. That's good news. No, we're not there yet. Instead, we have this more insidious version that suggests to people that they are not human enough to warrant appreciation and dignity, and us listening to their self-understanding. But the good news is in this: salvation of communities like this one, where in situations of oppression, we can come together and help and change and develop a sense of pride in people who need it, and step back and rest in humility when we need it. We walk this line between pride and humility, but the community always needs to take the side of supporting pride, letting and helping people grow into their sense of who they are and could be if the world didn't try to tell them who they were instead. Eli Clare said, "What I really want, and this is my prayer as well, is for all the many gendered possibilities in the world to be not normal, but rather profoundly ordinary and familiar, because we listened and we helped grow and we cared and we loved and we taught and we learned and we heard." That's what's possible in this world, but it takes salvation by community to make it happen, instead of individual fear and prejudice. Amen.